We now move on to the crisis between Nigeria and Niger at the moment. Now, the fallout from the military coup in Niger has continued as the country has reiterated its ban on flights emanating from or departing to Nigeria. In a notice to Airmen, which is known as NOTAM, issued by the country's Airspace Management Authority, it reiterated that flights from Nigeria will not be allowed to land in Niger. But it clarified that this restriction does not apply to commercial flights passing over Nigerian airspace without making a landing. Now, the NOTAM stated that the country's airspace, and I quote, is open to all national and international commercial flights from ground to unlimited except for Nigerian flights to or from Nigeria. Now, this notice states that the ADB-B, that's the Automatic Dependent Surveillance Broadcast or radar transponders for surveillance and communication, must remain on for any flight taking place in the Niger Republic airspace, and that the country's airspace remains closed for all military, operational and other special flights, except prior to authorization from competent authorities. End of quote. Now, Nigeria had previously announced the restatement of its ban on flights to and from Niger Republic through a similar notice to Airmen, NOTAM. The statement indicated that this measure was implemented in alignment with the ECOWAS resolution, and the action follows the overthrow of civilian rule in June 2023 in Niger, after which ECOWAS suspended the country. Well, Captain Roland Iyayi joins me in the studio. He is the Chief Executive Officer at TopBrass Airlines, a general aviation company. Iyayi is a former Director General of the Nigerian Airspace Management Agency, NAMA, and he's also a member of the Airline Operators of Nigeria. Thank you so much for joining us. Well, talk to us about this brickbat between Nigeria and Niger, and of course the consequences, especially in terms of flights, and then probably cost too, since it will affect the movement of aircraft within Nigerian and Nigerian airspace.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me. Incidentally, if you look at it, the Niger as a country borders over 700 miles of the northern Nigerian borders. So essentially it means that any southbound flights from Europe or any northbound flights from Nigeria would have to naturally traverse the airspace. But with the closure of that airspace to flights into and out of Nigeria specifically, what it means now is that any international flights originating from Nigeria or sort of ending in Nigeria from any part of the world that has to traverse the Nigerian airspace is banned. What that essentially means is that such flights will have to sort of go around the airspace. And if you look at it from a standpoint of the size, we're talking about maybe an addition in terms of flight time, anything between an hour and a half to 2 hours, depending on where you're coming from. That said, it increases drastically the cost of operation of international flights into and out of Nigeria, especially for domestic carriers that are designated to fly international. This is a huge cost in addition to what it is already incurring. Going by the economics of today, it's almost impossible to sustain this in the longer term.
Yeah, and of course the implication will be that the flight cost will increase. And
Absolutely.
Of course several air flights, especially those ones that are chartered to actually go to pilgrimage in Saudi Arabia and all of that, we've seen, because of the increase in airfare, I mean, the number of people who are going for such a pilgrimage actually reducing. And then, of course, you also see some flights that are emanating from places like Abuja going to Asia, I mean, maybe the Far East and all of that. Middle East also being affected.
Essentially.
Talk to us about how we could actually bridge this gap more, because Nigeria is simply implementing an ECOWAS mandate. And here the Nigerian authorities are also saying that, look, we are no longer part of ECOWAS. I mean, you guys will just have to deal with it. How do we have a win-win situation, if there could be any?
Well, essentially, this decision is a political decision. And of course, whatever solutions we're looking at will be a political solution. As it stands, Nigeria, being the president of the ECOWAS or the chairman of the ECOWAS committee at this point in time, would be duty bound to uphold, the whatever resolutions are reached by the ECOWAS body. So I think to that extent, we as a country, we would have to uphold that. Unfortunately, most of the other ECOWAS countries far to the west are not actually, to a large extent, affected by this airspace ban. Because, I mean, what it essentially says is that any international flight going to any other country other than Nigeria in the sub-region can overfly the airspace.
Yeah, but I was confused at some point because, I mean, from the NOTAM that was issued, I thought that they actually meant that, look, we can't originate a flight from Nigeria and land in their country, but we could actually pass through their airspace. And when you started explaining this, I was thinking if this is not against international aviation practice. I mean, how could you just shut your airspace to international flights?
Again, the provisions of the convention, ICAO, is that you as a nation state have sovereignty over your airspace. So to that extent, you can determine and establish clearly who can come in or go out. To the extent of sovereignty, the Nigerian government is is actually on its rights to say that, well, we're not going to allow your airliners to overfly our airspace.
Even when it's not a military...
Absolutely. They have the rights. But again, like I said, this is a political problem, and the only solution is a political solution. Any other thing we talk about here at this point will probably not even hold.
Yeah.
So I think there's a need to have dialogue between governments, and particularly the ECOWAS group. There's a need to initiate dialogue. Otherwise, what we're actually doing systematically is to, in terms of, maybe we're thinking we're hemorrhaging their economy, but ours, much bigger in terms of size and all that, is more adversely impacted than the Nigerian
and that's
economy.
why I was wondering who was hurting more, because I mean, we started this, we issued this first,
yes,
based on ECOWAS mandate and
yes,
all of that, and it looks like people are beginning to complain more from our side than theirs, because we have the traveling public much more larger from Nigeria than theirs. And you wonder how this could actually affect those in the aviation sector too. I mean, people like you.
Again, when you look at it, how many flights originate out of Niger on a daily basis? How many international flights do they have? Now, when you sort of juxtapose that with what we have in Nigeria, we have more international flights in and out of Nigeria, overflying the Nigerian airspace. Now, understand that all the other ECOWAS countries are not affected by this issue. Even though they're part of ECOWAS, they're not affected. So invariably, the major victim of this political impasse is Nigeria. Nigerian operators have more to bear than any other operator in the sub-region. So to that extent, the Nigerian economy is more adversely impacted than any other country in the sub-region. So I think it's important for the government to understand that, yes, indeed, there's a need to enforce the ECOWAS resolution, but at the same time, there's a need to understand that our hemorrhaging economy is even more important, because right now, if you look at the entire sub-region, put the entire population of a sub-region together, they're dwarfed by what we have in Nigeria. So when we look at it from that standpoint, I think it's even more important to say, like they say, charity begins at home. We should be more mindful of our own people. I mean, what we're going through, the issues at hand, how can we deal with them without, sort of exacerbating the situation? I think this particular impasse can only deteriorate our condition in the longer term.
And one thing I want you to actually focus on is the impact on international carriers, for example, and then even, within us generally, some of the operators within the sector. Now, what will happen to their flight frequencies and all of that? Will they be impacted in one way or the other?
Well, again, when you look at it, if, for instance, let's take a typical flight originating from Europe into Lagos. The detour around the Nigerian airspace can add anything between an hour and an hour and a half. That is a major cost to those airlines. Now, when you sort of change the scheduling of an international airline operation by as much as 3 hours, you can actually create a major disruption to the scheduling. So it is not entirely in their longer term interest. In terms of frequencies, I'm not sure they will reduce frequencies for the sake of this. they probably would put in place a contingency arrangement to see how to manage it. Of course, if an aircraft is not arriving on time, there's usually a standby aircraft for the next schedule, pending when it is this arrives, so at least there's no major disruptions. But it depends on how many aircraft they have in the buffer to take the slack in their scheduling. So these are issues that, unfortunately, international airlines have to bear at this point. But I'm also certain that given the long-term economic impact on the airlines, I am sure there will be diplomatic overtures that will be made to both the Nigerian government and the Nigerian government to find a political solution to this impasse. Well,
good enough. President Tinubu is actually the chairman of ECOWAS, and then he also has to reinforce the resolutions of ECOWAS. But let's just move on to other issues within Nigeria's aviation sector too. And you've seen several airlines actually having challenges because the flying public is actually dwindling too. Lots of people are not flying, and the NCAA rules here and there, and then of course issues of ticketing and challenges within the aviation sector. I mean, how's it going actually generally?
It's one of the worst times to be in the business. Domestic carriers are hemorrhaging, and it is worse. It's getting worse on a daily basis. Two major issues that need to be looked at urgently: the cost of funds. It's very critical to understand that Nigerian airline operators are not getting funds at the cheapest or most convenient rates. Access to foreign exchange is almost impossible. Some domestic carriers have, stock in the central bank, a lot of dollars, for which Naira equivalent has been taken from their accounts, upwards of 10 months. So, I mean, the issue when they talk about blocked funds, we're not necessarily talking about international airlines alone. I mean, we have a couple of Nigerian domestic carriers that have the same issues.
Wow, interesting.
So
how come we've not been hearing so much about the domestic airlines?
Unfortunately, the emphasis has been on foreign carriers. I mean, domestic airlines having to acquire forex for spares and maintenance, they've had to pay Nairas into their bank accounts to be remitted through the central bank for dollars. All such monies by some airlines are stuck upwards of 10 months. So we have a situation where domestic airlines are having it so difficult that their schedules are disrupted because they have a lot of their airplanes stuck in maintenance facilities out of a country because there's a shortage of forex. It's not accessible because it's not even available. And the black market is not even an option. Because, I mean, if you're selling at the official rate, and then you're going to black, I mean, you're buying the black market already, that's a huge loss. So to what intent and purpose? Now, a lot of domestic airlines, I mean, alternatively resorted to wet leases. This is even much more expensive, but that has been done.
And anytime I hear that word, I actually feel frightened because, I mean, remember what happened with the wet leased aircraft that was meant to come to Abuja and landed somewhere, was it Asaba also?
Well, fair enough. I mean, that was another matter entirely. However, I mean, having said that, I mean, the cost is humongous, and it's not in the interest of the domestic carriers or even in the interest of the industry, because what it means is when you bring in wet leased aircraft, you're actually putting some of your staff in the employment market because you're not engaging them, because these airplanes come complete with crew. And you have all these guys trained, sitting there doing nothing because your aircraft that could have been flying are stuck in maintenance facilities all over the world. So it's a double-edged sword, and airlines are hemorrhaging. I mean, the essence of bringing in the wet leases beyond everything else is for schedule integrity. But that is not even possible when you have inadequate infrastructure. Most of the delays we encounter as domestic operators, listen, you have 100% of delays, only 5% of such delays can be attributable to airlines. 95% is the service providers and government. So if a government is not taking care of its own business, how do you expect airlines to be able to perform? So the point is, it's important to understand, and for the traveling public to understand how these things work. When an airline is delayed early on the first flight out of Lagos, for instance, say 30 minutes, at the end of the day, that 30 minutes can evolve and, the ripple effect can roll over to about 3.5 hours of the day for which the aircraft productivity is lost. Already, we have a narrow window of operations in the country because of the inadequate infrastructure to start with. So whereas the domestic airlines should have been doing about between 8 and 10 hours of aircraft utilization per day, we're stuck with about 6. So already you're losing about 30 to 40% of your productivity on the aircraft asset.
All right.
So when you put all of this together, it is almost an impossible environment to operate and be profitable.
All right, Captain Roland Iyayi, I won't let you go without talking about the sad situation we actually had during the weekend where a Eurocopter helicopter actually crashed with a Nigerian business executive, banking executive with Access Bank, Herbert Wigwe, and then, of course, former chairman of the Nigerian Exchange, and then with the family members. I mean, and people are beginning to ask questions, actually. I mean, we thought that the U.S. airspace was the safest and all of that, but here we had a chopper flying at night, and then, of course, this accident happening. And not just only that, prior to that, like about 2 or 3 days before then, we had even this light aircraft, crashing on the highway and all of that. So, and people are beginning to ask, what's going on actually in the U.S. compared to us?
First of all, I want to extend my condolences to the Wigwe family and all the other members of the, Ogumbanja family as well, for the sad event. Late Herbert Wigwe was somebody I knew personally as well. Yeah. It's unfortunate, but having said that, the airspace is as safe as the systems that are put in place to ensure that operators and the regulators are compliant. Now, in this particular case, the particular aircraft type, the EC-130B4, has had a series of accidents in recent times to the extent that actually a court in the U.S. Awarded against the operator of a particular accident and the manufacturer a whopping sum of $75 million in favor of a victim. When you look at it from the standpoint, in this particular case, I don't want to be speculative, but when you take cognizance of the conditions that were, at the time of the flight, the conditions of flight and the terrain, a lot can be deduced from those things. I expect by the time the NTSB, that's the Transportation Safety Bureau in the U.S., by the time they're done with their preliminary findings, as it were, we would establish clearly some of the factors that could lead or that could have led to the crash. But importantly, this particular aircraft is not certified to come with a cockpit voice recorder. Yeah,
and I was surprised myself. I was shocked, actually.
That's simply, that is simply because the category of the aircraft itself does not require that by regulation.
Okay.
Yeah, you can do without that. It's a single engine aircraft. You can use it for charters. It's actually used for flight seeing, around the area. So basically, it's a very economic type for the type of operations being used. Okay. It's been used for. In this particular circumstance, some of the things we've heard, particularly in one accident prior to this, in which the pilot survived, it was said that the aircraft lost control in a major gust. Now, that itself could be an issue, but I don't want to assume anything or presuppose anything in this particular case. If that was an issue that the NTSB has seen, and this particular flight was over a mountainous area where you could have a lot of convective activity, particularly at night with some slight rain, then these are factors I'm sure they would look at, and obviously at the end of the day, they might be able to come up with the probable cause of the accident, and hopefully at the end of the day, we'll be able to get some sort of closure to this.
Yeah, if this had happened in Nigeria, the government would have almost been swallowed, but people are beginning to ask for us to actually recognize that, these things happen anywhere.
Again, aviation is international, and to that extent, once you have systems and procedures in place, and the regulator upholds those systems and procedures, invariably, you have a structure and a system that works. It becomes almost assumed that for every flight, you're safe. However, yes, sometimes, we have sort of accidents and incidents like this that now make us to look back again and look inwards and ask, how did it happen, and what can we do next time to make sure we don't get the same thing? That's the essence, by the way, of every accident investigation. So I believe by the time this investigation is concluded, we'll have a much safer airspace to fly in, even in America.
All right, we must thank you so much. Captain Roland Iyayi is the Chief Executive Officer at TopBrass Aviation, which is a general aviation company. He's joined us to help us look at the ongoing brickbat between Nigeria and Niger over the country's airspace and, of course, international flights crisscrossing that country. And, of course, he's also helped us to understand some domestic aviation issues. We must thank you so much. And of course, our condolences also go to the Herbert Wigwe family, and of course that of Abimbola Ogunbanjo, of course, the former chairman of the Nigerian Stock Exchange, who died during that crash. Our hearts are with you. Well, that's how it's been for this edition of Arise Primetime. Do join us again tomorrow. From me and the entire team here in Abuja, goodbye and thank you for watching. I'm Samna Sambo.